Welcome back. In this video, we are going to talk about the different kind of games. In the first video, we learned what do we mean by a game. Game is basically a strategic interaction where my payoff depends not only on my action but also on other decision makers' action. What does it mean? That when I am taking an action to maximize my payoff, I have to think about what others are going to do. Further, I have to be aware that others must be going through the similar kind of reasoning, because others would also understand that their payoff would depend not only on what they do but also on what others do. So we have to form belief about what others are going to do. Based on that belief, we have to take the best possible action. And if our beliefs are right, we can say we don't need to change our behavior. We will see this kind of discussion while studying the games. And of course, a science that studies these games is called game theory. So let us look at different classification first. So we have paid attention to two kinds of game. In a way, we have paid attention to more than two kinds of game, but in one instance I am going to take simultaneous versus sequential. What do we mean? So the game, that restaurant game we had, where we were talking about two friends are deciding whether to buy a cheap item for oneself or expensive item for oneself. And we said the way we proceeded that player 1 is deciding cheap versus expensive and cheap versus expensive. When player 1 is deciding whether to go for cheap or expensive, player 1 doesn't know what player 2 has decided. And similarly, when player 2 is deciding whether to go for cheap option or expensive option, player 2 doesn't know what player 1 has decided. So simultaneous basically means that when I am deciding, I am not aware of what other players have done. When other players are deciding, they are also not aware what everyone else has done. So this sort of a strategic interaction is considered as simultaneous move game. Because in this, we can say when we are modeling it, and I am using a term modeling, what do we mean by a model? And I will digress little bit. When I ask you that from Kanpur I have to reach Chennai, how should I come to Chennai? Of course, you may give an option for train or a flight, but you are not going to represent each and every town, village, taluka in the middle. You will just say the prominent place that from IIT Kanpur you need to reach railway station, from railway station you need to take this train. So when we model a real life scenario, we abstract from many unnecessary detail. So when we are modeling a strategic interaction, we are going to abstract from unnecessary detail. So it's not necessary that player 1 and 2 are really deciding without knowing what other has done. But we can always model it like that we ignore this particular knowledge that player 1 knows that what player 2 has done, or player 2 knows what player 1 has done. So it's very much possible that when player 1 decides to buy cheap item or expensive item, player 2 gets to observe. In a way, I am moving, this is what we are going to talk about game tree later on, but it should be clear that here player 1 is deciding to go for cheap item or expensive item, player 2 is observing, and then player 2 is going for cheap item or expensive item, and here payoff would be realized. So here clearly at this point, player 2 knows that player 1 has decided to go for cheap food. Here player 2 knows that player 1 has decided to go for expensive food. So this is another way to model, and this kind of modeling is called sequential move game. I should say further that simultaneous move game is also called strategic move game. Please understand one thing, that when we are talking about simultaneous move game, we are ignoring the time factor. We are assuming that everything has happened once and for all at very beginning. So in a way, because we are ignoring the time factor, it's a static setting. This is, we can say it is a static setting. We don't see the way game is progressing. If we are in this setting, we see the way game is progressing, and therefore we can call it dynamic setting. So these are two extreme. Clearly that in this particular setting, the description is much more richer, because here we are assuming that when player 1 is deciding to take an action, player 1 is not aware of player 2's action. Here it is possible to incorporate both. We can have a dotted line here indicating that player 2 has not observed whether player 1 has taken action C or E, and player 1 knows that player 1 has decided, but player 2 doesn't know the exact action. So this description is rich in comparison to the strategic move game. This has another name also, normal form game. For two player we can also have this as a tabular form, we can say. But we have seen when the number of players is excessively high, or even when you have very high number of action available for each one of the player, then you cannot use a tabular form to represent it. Nevertheless, you can still use a strategic move or a strategic form game to represent it. In strategic form game, what you have basically three things. One, list of players that we have talked about, the actions available to each player, and they may have the same action available. So far the game I have been showing, in most of the game each player have the same action, except the adverse selection game, in which acquirer makes an offer and target accepts or reject. So what I am trying to say, the players can have same set of actions or different set of action, and each action combination, we can say each action combination can be listed and each player should have preference defined over that list. What do I mean? Whether this box is best for player 1 or this box is best for player 1, or what is the ranking when it comes to liking. There can be separate ranking list for player 1 and there can be separate ranking list for player 2. And if you have n player, 2000 player, each player can have ranking list. So three things are required. When we look at sequential move game, then we have additional thing. What are those additional thing? That we can write here, that how much, in blue color, how much a player knows when he or she has to take an action. That's additional thing. That's additional requirement. Of course, here also list of player is required, each action is required, but here action is required only at the beginning for once. In this particular setting, action is required. What player 1 is doing here, it's very much possible that player 1 gets to play here again. So what action player 1 is taking at different point of time, and also how much of the information each player has when he or she has to take action. And this we are going to deal separately. We will talk about information. So that's quite important, but broadly as of now we see that these are the two different kind of game. We can also say that it is a static game and it is a dynamic game. Okay.